use of the beanbags. Can I have your patterns? How long does it take you to make a plushie pattern? What fabric do you use? How do I make plushies like you? Today, we find out. People always ask me how I make my plushies, my patterns, and even what fabric I use. And today, I'm answering 5 of my most frequently asked plushie making questions. So, without any further ado, let's answer some questions. Question 1. Where or how did you learn how to make plushies? So, interestingly enough, I kind of taught myself how to make plushies. Initially, I watched one singular tutorial on what a dart was and taught myself from there. Unfortunately, when I went to find that video to link it in this video, I could not find it. From what I can tell, it kind of seems like it might have been deleted. But if you happen to stumble across a tutorial on exactly what a dart is, and you see me in the comments from 5-6 years ago, that is the video I'm talking about. Obviously, I've seen a few tutorials on little details since that tutorial, but overall, the majority of my plushie making knowledge has been forged through years of trial and error. Is that the best or fastest way to learn? No, absolutely not. But it's not like there were plushie making classes anywhere or anything, so self-taught was kind of the only way I could learn. Hopefully though, my videos can work as a basic baseline for people thinking about going into plushie making. They're not meant as tutorials, but I love it when people can learn a thing or two from them anyway. I think people can learn a lot just from watching someone do something. I personally learned 99% of my sculpting knowledge from watching people north of the border right here on YouTube. Definitely not tutorials, but still lots to learn. Question 2. How do store-bought plushies get made without a hand-sewn seam? Okay, now this isn't one I've gotten asked a lot, but I did answer this one over on my TikTok a while back, and I had more people than I thought I would who didn't know that this was how this worked. So don't feel bad if you didn't realize this either, because apparently a lot of people didn't. So, how do store-bought plushies get made without a hand-sewn seam? The answer is, they don't! Nearly every store-bought plushie will have a seam that's either hand-sewn or pulled together by hand in the case of things like Build-A-Bear. This is because you will almost always need a hole to turn a plushie right side to. The only exception would be is if you're making a plushie where some or all of the seams are visible on the outside. But 9 times out of 10, a store-bought plushie will be sewn inside out, turned right side to for stuffing, and have a hole left over called the stuffing hole. That's where the stuffing goes. Then it's usually stitched up with a super simple ladder stitch. You can identify these hand-sewn seams by their characteristic zigzag shape. Regular seams will be nice and straight, while hand-sewn ones, even ones sewn very carefully, will be a little zigzag shaped. So don't ever feel bad if you have to have a thing or two hand-sewn on your plushies. That's literally just how plushies work. So you're doing just fine. Question 3. What fabric do you use? I personally use a lot of different fabrics for a lot of different reasons and uses. No fabric will fit every use, so it's good to be able to work with more than one kind. As for my fabric preferences, they may or may not work for you and your projects since no 2 creators are identical, but the majority of the smooth minky fabric you'll see me use is Shannon Fabrics Cuddle Minky No. 3, and the majority of the fur fabric you'll see me use is Shannon Fabrics Luxe Cuddle Seal. When I'm patterning, I'll typically use anti-pill fleece. That's because it's cheap and matches the stretch of the other 2 fabrics I use pretty frequently really well. But it's extremely important to remember 2 things about this information. 1, the stretch of your main fabric must match almost perfectly with your prototyping fabric. Otherwise, your pattern will not work properly. I just recently made the mistake of patterning with 0 stretch fabric, while my main fabric for the project actually had a tiny bit of stretch horizontally. That tiny bit of stretch, even though the fabric was labeled as no stretch, actually made a huge difference. For example, my darts suddenly weren't wide enough to hold the shape I needed them to. The second thing to remember is that fabrics age differently. Anti-pill fleece might seem fine at first, but it ages like milk. The fur I use, gorgeous, luxurious, amazing, but it ages pretty quickly. It's not terrible and still feels fine, but it definitely does not look the same. These are just a couple examples of how a fabric could age, so keep that in mind when choosing your fabric. You certainly can't change it after the plushie's been made. Whoop, look at that! Time for a change of scenery. And wouldn't it be so fun if we just didn't number the questions we answer here? Not because I realized this video was way too short, way too late, or anything like that, but for funsies. Anyway, these are going to be questions specifically from commenters on my community post where I asked for sewing questions. So, first up, Pop-Tart That Is Buttered asks, How long does it take you to make a plushie pattern? Well, that one really depends on the plushie. Some are super simple, and some can take a really long time. And I mean like a long time. Let's look at some examples. This little keychain plushie here probably took me something like 10 minutes to pattern, and testing it probably took 30 minutes or less. So that's under an hour for this whole pattern, which this and many more are on my Etsy shop right now. Just thought I'd mention that. But if we take a look at this cutie, this one took me 2 days to make the initial pattern, but then it took me 10 extra days to test and adjust the pattern to get it just right. And then there's stuff like one of the plushies I have scheduled for October. That plushie, I've been working on its pattern since April, and it's still not done. It was supposed to go out this past March, meaning yes, Sprigatito was the backup plushie, and I've been behind schedule ever since. But point being, patterns can take wildly different amounts of time depending on what they are. And sometimes simple patterns can take forever, and complicated ones could be pretty fast. It just depends on your plushie making knowledge and what patterns you've already made to be able to use as references. I don't know how to say this name. Next up, Patas VFX asks, what is the use of the beanbags? So what this is referencing are the beanbags I make to put in my plushies before the stuffing. And the answer is actually pretty simple. The beanbags are for weight. Now, I don't always use a beanbag. Sometimes the weighting material will go straight into a plushie skin itself. But when I do use a beanbag, it's usually so the weight stays in one specific area. I've definitely had issues in the past with weight migrating up the legs if it's not in a bag of some sort. Never really had an issue with the arms though. Probably because the arms are almost always hanging straight down. Gravity and all that. Works like a dream. Now, lastly for our commenter questions, All the Damn Vampires 006 asks, do you have any tips for sewing with double-sided minky? I do indeed. Next question. I'm kidding. How I personally deal with extra slippery fabric is making sure I use an absurd amount of pins. Like every square inch should be covered in pins. I also make sure to sew very slowly. And that's because if it's the same double-sided minky I use, it can be really stretchy. If you sew too fast, it'll stretch the fabric and you'll end up with some weird wrinkly seams. And my last piece of advice, just be careful and patient. I know I've personally gotten a little too comfortable not giving my full attention to the machine while I'm sewing things that I think are supposed to be easy to sew. But sometimes it just needs a little more attention. Take the time to do it right and you won't have to do it over again. That's what I tell myself all the time when I'm working on these big plushie projects. Easy is rarely the best way. But now, let's head back to those numbered questions. I'm sure this scene change won't be jarring at all. And then make it super jarring. Question 4. How do I make plushies like you? Now we have moved into the questions that I get kind of nonstop. And you're probably not gonna like the answer. That answer being years of practice. Sure, I could lay out step by step how it's done. I could say my process is come up with an idea, draw it, make a pattern, test it, sew the final plush, and I'm done. But that is entirely unhelpful to anyone trying to figure out how I do what I do. That leads us right into question 5. The question that almost always follows up question 4. How do I make plushie patterns? I get this question literally nonstop and is almost always paired with or followed up with, also, can I have your patterns? And the answer to that question is yes and no. I do not give out or sell my big plushie patterns, especially not if they're fan art. That would be illegal. What I do give out are small beginner sewing patterns over on my Patreon. Fair tier patrons get sewing patterns and tutorials alternating every other month. But there's also all these benefits too. Super fun, super cool. I'm sure you'll find at least one thing you enjoy there. And real quick, while we're on the topic, I just want to say a huge thank you to my Pixie tier and above patrons. You truly do keep this channel running. But now, as for how I, or more appropriately you, can make patterns like I do, well, I think most people who ask this question, or some variation of it, want an answer that lays out exactly what to do to make things just like I make right now. They think of the question similarly to how you might ask how to, give a thumbs up. With that, I could just explain, you make a fist, point your thumb upwards and you've done it. The results of that question and answer are pretty immediate. The results of this question, however, are less immediate. And that's because it's knowledge-based, not physicality-based. Think of it like asking how you do rocket science. So, how does one make patterns like I do? Well, just like rocket science, it's about learning the basics. Get ready because we have another analogy coming. Now, in my experience, making patterns is a lot like drawing, in the sense that you start with some basic shapes and then add detail as you go. For example, you could break down drawing something like a house into basic shapes, like a square, a triangle, a rectangle. But as you go or learn more, you can add more and more detail until you've drawn something like a photorealistic house. The same goes for making plushies, just with a little more 3D geometry involved. I don't have time to go fully in depth in this video, but I am hoping to make a full how to plushie tutorial series for my Bear Tier patrons over on Patreon. Like I said before, every other month my Bear Tier patrons get a tutorial, and hopefully starting in November-ish, those tutorials will be part of a potentially 10-part series that should teach you everything you need to know to get started making your very first plushie. And the fact that it would be 10 parts is exactly why I can't go over everything in this video. But what I can tell you are what some of the basics are. That would be learning how to make basic shapes, learning all the ways to make flat shapes 3D, how to connect shapes together, how different fabric affects your patterns, different ways to stuff a plushie, basic hand sewing, you know, things like that. Honestly, I can't wait to make those tutorials for you all. And hopefully once my patrons have had them for a few months, I'll be able to post them right here on YouTube too. Just don't expect tutorials here for a while yet. I'm still scripting everything. But I really do hope I've answered some of your burning questions today. If I did, give this video a like and subscribe for more plushie related content. And hit that bell so you don't miss it when I do eventually come back here with tutorials. But if I didn't answer your question, go ahead and leave it in the comments below. I might just pick it for the next Q&A. Nothing's too complicated, obvious, or silly for me to answer. And don't forget to check out these videos on the right. I think you'll really enjoy them.